Hey guys, tonight we imagine you're standing at the edge of the world, or at least it feels that way. In front of you is an impassable, churning sea. Behind you, the ground trembles with the thunder of 600 of the most elite war chariots in existence, bearing down with the single-minded purpose of your annihilation. The air is thick with salt and fear, and the screams of a million panicked souls are your only chorus. Let's be honest, in this scenario, your survival odds are statistically indistinguishable from zero. You probably won't survive this. And yet, this is where our stories begin, in those moments of absolute impossibility, where human strength ends and something else, something awe-inspiring and terrifyingly powerful, takes over. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I love seeing where you're all listening from, so feel free to post your location and local time in the comments below. It's always a treat to see how far these stories travel. Our story begins not with a bang, but with a shuddering silence that blankets the entire land of Egypt. For weeks, the nation, the very jewel of the ancient world, has been brought to its knees. The Nile, the lifeblood of its empire, had turned to blood, its stench choking the air. Swarms of frogs, then gnats, then flies had descended, a relentless, crawling, buzzing tide of divine judgment that no amount of royal power could sweep away. Livestock had fallen in the fields, and boils had erupted on the skin of priests and commoners alike. A storm of fire and ice had shattered the crops, and a carpet of locusts had consumed whatever remained. Then, a profound darkness, a thick, palpable blackness that could be felt, had smothered the land for 3 days, a terrifying dress rehearsal for the final, most devastating blow. Tonight is the night of that final blow. It is the culmination of 10 plagues, 10 divine statements against the stubborn pride of a pharaoh who believed himself to be a god. In the sprawling slave quarters of Goshen, where the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob have dwelled for 430 years, the air is thick with a different kind of tension. It is not the silence of dread, but the quiet hum of fearful, desperate obedience. Inside a small mud brick dwelling, a man named Eleazar watches his wife, Tamar, as she works by the flickering light of an oil lamp. Their 2 children, a teenage daughter named Sarah, and a young, wide-eyed son, Caleb, sit huddled on a straw mat in the corner, their usual childish energy replaced by a solemn stillness. The aroma in their small home is one they have never experienced before. It is the smell of roasting lamb, an almost sacrilegious luxury for a slave family. But the instructions had been precise, delivered by their elder, Moses, the man who spoke with God. A perfect lamb, 1 year old, without blemish. Its blood, collected in a basin, had been smeared on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of their home, a stark, crimson sign painted in the encroaching twilight. Eleazar can still feel the sticky wetness on his fingers, the gravity of that simple, profound act. It was a mark of protection, a shield against the horror that was to be unleashed upon the land of their oppressors. "Is it ready?" Elazar asks, his voice a low whisper, as if a louder sound might break the fragile spell of safety they have cast around their home. Tamar nods, her face pale in the lamplight. She pulls the roasted meat from the small fire pit in the center of the room. With it are unleavened bread, flat, cracker-like discs made in a hurry, with no time for yeast to work its magic, and bitter herbs, a pungent reminder of the bitterness of their long bondage. The instructions had been clear about this part too. "Eat it in haste," Moses had said, relaying God's command. "With your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand." They gather around the meal, not in their usual relaxed way, but standing, poised for a journey they can barely comprehend. Caleb clutches a small wooden staff Elazar had carved for him, his knuckles white. He looks at his father, his young mind trying to process the enormity of the moment. "Father," he whispers, "is the destroyer coming soon?" Elazar places a hand on his son's shoulder, trying to project a calm he does not feel. "The Lord will pass over us, my son. The blood will be a sign. He will see it, and he will not allow the destroyer to enter our homes. We are safe." He says the words as much for himself as for his family. For 4 centuries, his people had known nothing but the crack of the whip, the weight of the sun on their backs as they mixed straw and mud, the grief of sons born into servitude. Freedom was a half-forgotten prayer, a myth whispered by the elders. To believe it was truly at hand felt like an act of rebellion against reality itself. As they eat the meal, the savory meat, the bland, dense bread, the sharp, almost painful bitterness of the herbs, a sound begins to build outside. It starts low, a single mournful cry from a nearby Egyptian home, then another and another. Soon, the night air is torn apart by a symphony of anguish. It is a wail of a scope and intensity that none of them have ever heard, a sound of collective, nationwide agony. It is the sound of a promise being kept. In every Egyptian household, from the opulent palace of Pharaoh to the humblest soldier's hovel, the firstborn son has died. The destroyer has passed through the land, and only the homes marked with the blood of the Lamb have been spared. Caleb buries his face in his mother's robes, trembling. Sarah, older and more aware, simply weeps silently, the tears tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. Elazar stands frozen, his staff held tight in his hand. He can feel the tectonic plates of history shifting beneath his feet. The mighty Egyptian empire, a civilization that had stood for centuries, was broken in a single night. And his people, a nation of slaves, were about to walk free. The chaos outside grows. Through the cracks in their door, they can see torches moving frantically. The wailing is now punctuated by shouts, by doors being thrown open, by the sounds of people running in the streets. Then comes a new sound, a hammering on their own door. Elazar's heart leaps into his throat. Tamar gasps, pulling her children closer. But the voice that calls out is not one of anger. It is one of sheer, unadulterated panic. "Go," an Egyptian voice shrieks from the other side. "Leave us. Take whatever you want, just go before we are all dead. Another voice joins in, this one belonging to the wife of the very overseer who had whipped Eleazar just a week before. Please, take my silver, take my gold. Just leave this land and bless us as you go. Your God is too powerful. Soon it is a chorus. Their Egyptian neighbors, the very people who had scorned and beaten them, are now at their doors, not with weapons, but with offerings. They thrust jewelry, fine linens, and bags of coins into their hands, their faces streaked with tears and terror. They are not just letting the Israelites go, they are expelling them, desperate to be rid of the people whose God could command such terrifying power. The word comes down the line, passed from family to family, a ripple of command that spreads through the slave quarters like wildfire. It comes from Moses and Aaron. It is time. The Exodus begins not as a triumphant march, but as a chaotic, stumbling, disbelieving flood of humanity pouring out into the pre-dawn darkness. It is a river of people, 600,000 men of fighting age, and with them, women, children, the elderly, and a vast, mixed multitude of other slaves and Egyptians who have decided to cast their lot with this newly freed nation. They carry their unleavened dough on their backs, wrapped in cloaks. They lead their flocks and herds, a cacophony of bleating sheep and lowing cattle mixing with the weeping of children and the excited, hushed whispers of their parents. Eleazar guides his family into the throng. Caleb, now perched on his father's shoulders, looks back one last time at the small brick house that had been the only home he had ever known. Then he looks forward, and his jaw drops. Moving at the head of the vast column is something inexplicable, something divine. By day, it is a towering pillar of cloud, a swirling, majestic column that reaches from the desert floor to the heavens, providing shade from the relentless sun. By night, it will transform into a pillar of fire, a blazing beacon that illuminates their path and warms them against the desert cold. It is God made visible. It is their guide, their protector, their unmistakable sign that they are not alone on this terrifying journey into the unknown. This is no mere escape. It is a divinely orchestrated departure. For the first few days, the mood is one of pure euphoria. They sing songs their ancestors had sung, songs of hope and of a promised land flowing with milk and honey. They are free. The words taste sweet and strange on their tongues. 430 years of bondage ended, generations of prayers answered. Eleazar finds himself laughing, a deep, full-throated laugh he didn't know he possessed. He watches Caleb chase after other boys, their feet kicking up the dust of freedom. And for the first time, he allows himself to dream of a future where his son will be a landowner, a free man, not a slave. But their guide, the pillar of cloud, does not lead them on the most direct route. It bypasses the well-trodden coastal road, the way of the Philistines, a path that would have taken them towards their destination quickly, but would have also led them straight into conflict. Instead, the pillar turns them south, leading them into the desolate, unforgiving wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula. The terrain becomes harsher, the initial euphoria tempered by the hard reality of the desert. And then the pillar leads them to a place called Pi-hahiroth, a narrow passage with the shimmering, vast expanse of the Red Sea directly in front of them, and impassable, rugged mountains hemming them in on either side. They are, for all intents and purposes, trapped. Eleazar feels a prickle of unease. He looks at the sea, then at the mountains. There is no escape route. They are utterly exposed. Why has God led us here? He murmurs to Tamar, who pulls her shawl tighter, her eyes scanning the horizon behind them, a deep-seated dread beginning to bloom in her heart. Meanwhile, back in the palace of Egypt, the wails of grief have subsided, replaced by a cold, hard silence. Pharaoh sits on his throne, the finery of his court, a bitter mockery of his new reality. His son, his heir, is gone. The economic heart of his empire, his entire slave labor force, is also gone. The initial terror that had prompted him to release the Israelites has now begun to curdle into a potent mixture of rage, humiliation, and economic panic. His generals and advisors, their own families also touched by the plague, gather around him. "What is this we have done?" one of them asks, his voice trembling with fury. "We have let the Israelites go from serving us. Who will build the new temple at Karnak? Who will quarry the stone for the royal tombs? We have let our greatest asset simply walk away." Another chimes in, his words dripping with military pride. They are wandering aimlessly in the wilderness. The desert has shut them in. They are a disorganized mob of slaves, burdened with children and livestock. They are an easy target. The words find fertile ground in Pharaoh's hardened heart. The grief for his son twists into a burning desire for vengeance. The humiliation of being defeated by the god of slaves is an insult that cannot stand. His power, his divinity, had been challenged and found wanting. He would reassert it. He would show this Hebrew god and the world who truly ruled. "Make ready my chariot," Pharaoh commands, his voice like the cracking of a whip. The lethargy of mourning shatters, replaced by the frantic energy of war preparation. "And summon the army. Take 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. We will pursue them. We will overtake them. I will bring them back, and I will gain glory for myself over this Moses and his people. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." Of course, he didn't mean the true Lord, but himself. The Egyptian war machine, the most formidable military force on the planet, roars to life. The 600 elite chariots are a terrifying sight. Each one is a state-of-the-art weapon platform, lightweight and maneuverable, pulled by two powerful, specially trained stallions. A driver, skilled and steady, controls the horses, while a warrior stands beside him, armed with a powerful composite bow and a quiver full of bronze-tipped arrows, a spear, and a shield. These are the special forces of their day, the apex predators of the ancient battlefield. Behind them comes the main force, thousands of other chariots and infantry, a cloud of dust, and a thunder of hooves that shakes the very earth. They are not just coming to recapture slaves, they are coming for annihilation, fueled by a king's grief and a nation's wounded pride. Back at the edge of the Red Sea, the Israelites have set up a temporary camp. The day is drawing to a close, and the pillar of cloud is beginning to glow with the first hints of its fiery nighttime transformation. It is then that a lookout, perched high on a rocky outcrop, gives a terrified shout. He points back the way they came, his arm trembling. A low rumble is heard, a distant vibration felt more in the bones than in the ears. Then the horizon darkens. A massive cloud of dust, far too large to be a sandstorm, is rising against the setting sun. And within it, glinting like deadly stars, are the metallic flashes of armor and chariot wheels. The realization dawns with sickening speed. It's Pharaoh. He has changed his mind. He is coming for them. The camp erupts into pandemonium. The euphoric songs of freedom are replaced by screams of pure terror. Mothers grab their children, their faces white with fear. Men who had just begun to walk with the posture of free individuals now look back at the approaching army with the ingrained terror of a slave seeing his master's chariot. They are trapped. The sea is at their front, the mountains are on their flanks, and the vengeful Egyptian army is at their back. There is no escape. Their miraculous deliverance has led them to a death trap. Eleazar's blood runs cold. He pulls Tamar and the children behind a large boulder, as if it could offer any protection. Caleb is crying, not understanding what is happening, but feeding off the raw panic of the adults around him. Tamar is praying, her words a frantic, whispered torrent. A crowd of men, their faces contorted with rage and fear, surges towards the tent of Moses and Aaron. They are the leaders, the ones who had promised them freedom, the ones who had led them to this place of certain death. They surround Moses, their voices rising in a crescendo of accusation. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? One man shouts, spitting on the ground near Moses' feet. What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Another screams, his fists clenched. Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Eleazar watches, his own heart a knot of fear and doubt. The men are right. Bondage was brutal, but it was life. This was a slaughterhouse. He looks at Moses, expecting to see the same fear that is paralyzing his own limbs. But Moses stands firm. He lets the wave of panic and accusation wash over him. He doesn't flinch. He stands there, a man of 80 years, his face weathered by decades in the wilderness, and in his eyes is a calm that seems utterly alien in the midst of the hysteria. He raises his hands, not to defend himself, but to silence the crowd. And when he speaks, his voice is not his own. It is a voice imbued with an authority that cuts through the noise. A voice that speaks of a different reality than the one their terrified eyes can see. Do not be afraid. Moses booms, his voice resonating with a power that stills the mob. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. The Lord will fight for you. The words hang in the air, a preposterous claim in the face of 600 war chariots. Be still. How could anyone be still when death itself was thundering towards them? But Moses turns his back on the crowd. He turns his back on the approaching army. He turns his face towards the impassable sea and cries out to his God. And God's answer comes back, not just to Moses, but in a way the entire nation can witness. A dramatic shift occurs. The pillar of cloud, which had been leading them, majestically lifts from its position at the front of the camp and moves with supernatural speed to the rear. It settles itself directly between the camp of the Israelites and the advancing Egyptian army. And as it does, it undergoes a stunning transformation. To the Israelites, its fiery glow intensifies, casting a warm, comforting light over their entire camp, illuminating the terrified faces of families huddled together, a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. It is a shield of fire, a divine rear guard. But for the Egyptians, the effect is the opposite. The pillar becomes a wall of thick, impenetrable darkness. The lead charioteers pull back on their reins, their horses rearing and whinnying in confusion. One moment they were bearing down on their prey in the fatting twilight. The next, they are plunged into a supernatural gloom that their torches cannot pierce. They are disoriented, their charge halted, their progress completely arrested. The thunder of their advance is reduced to the confused shouting of men and the nervous stamping of horses. Then Moses walks to the edge of the Red Sea. He stands before the churning water, the symbol of their entrapment, and as instructed by God, he raises his staff, the simple wooden shepherd's staff that had become a conduit for divine power, the staff that had turned the Nile to blood and summoned the plagues. He holds it out over the water, and God unleashes the wind. It is not a gentle breeze. It is a powerful, persistent, roaring east wind that begins to blow with ferocious intensity. All night long it howls, a sustained, deafening gale that whips sand into the air and tears at their cloaks. But it is not a destructive wind. It is a purposeful wind. It is focused entirely on the sea. The Israelites, huddled in the strange light of the pillar of fire, watch in stunned silence. The surface of the sea begins to churn, to pull back. The water does not simply recede. It is being driven back, split in two. Slowly, painstakingly, hour after agonizing hour, a path begins to emerge where there was once only water. The wind is a divine tool, carving a highway through the heart of the sea. By the first light of dawn, the miracle is complete. The wind subsides, and an eerie silence falls. Before them lies a sight that will be seared into the consciousness of their nation forever. The Red Sea has been parted. A wide, dry corridor stretches from their shore to the opposite side, and on their left and on their right, the water stands up like two colossal, vertical walls, a liquid mountain range held in place by nothing visible. The ground on the path is not muddy or slick. It is dry, as if it had never known water. Moses turns to the people, his face illuminated by the pillar of fire behind them and the dawning sun before them. He doesn't need to speak. He simply gestures with his staff towards the impossible pathway. Go. Elazar grabs Caleb's hand so tightly the boy winces. Stay with me, he breathes, his voice tight with awe and terror. He takes the first step, leaving the solid ground of the shore and stepping onto the seabed. The ground is firm beneath his sandals. He looks up, and his breath catches in his chest. To his right, a sheer cliff of water towers stories above him, shimmering and green in the early light. He can see fish, large and small, swimming as if in a giant, invisible aquarium, their movements suspended and strange. The same impossible wall stands to his left. The air is heavy with the smell of salt and wet sand, and the only sound is the muffled, distant roar of the contained sea and the shuffling feet of 2 million people walking into the heart of a miracle. It is a terrifying and exhilarating passage. They are walking on the floor of the sea, in a place no human being was ever meant to be. They are utterly vulnerable, a tiny stream of humanity flowing between two crushing certainties of death. Yet, they are completely safe. They hurry, casting nervous glances at the watery walls, but they move with a new sense of purpose. The God who could do this would surely see them to the other side. As the last of the Israelites, the rear guard, steps onto the seabed path, the supernatural darkness that has been confounding the Egyptian army finally lifts. The sun is now rising, and the Egyptians see a sight that stuns them. Their prey is escaping through the middle of the sea. Pharaoh, his heart still hardened and his mind blinded by arrogance, does not see a divine miracle. He sees a tactical opportunity. He sees his enemy trapped in a narrow canyon. After them, he roars, cracking his whip. They will not escape. The entire Egyptian army, the chariots, the horses, the infantry, charges into the corridor of water. They thunder onto the dry seabed in pursuit, confident in their speed and power. But the ground that was dry for the Israelites is not dry for them. The moment their heavy chariot wheels hit the path, the ground seems to turn to thick, clinging mud. The wheels get bogged down, sinking deep into the seabed. The horses strain, panic, and fall, their legs tangled in the traces. The perfect, orderly charge descends into a chaotic, log-jammed nightmare. Chariots crash into one another. Soldiers are thrown to the ground. The corridor of the sea becomes a corridor of confusion and terror. The Egyptian soldiers, mired and helpless, look up at the towering walls of water. And for the first time, they understand. Their own gods are powerless here. They are in the domain of another God, a mightier God. Let's get away from the Israelites, they shout to one another over the chaos. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. By now, Moses and the entire nation of Israel have reached the far shore. They scramble onto the rocky beach, turning to watch the unfolding drama. They are safe, they are free, and their God is not finished. The Lord speaks to Moses one last time. Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen. Moses, standing on the shore as the leader of a free people, raises his hand and the shepherd's staff one final time over the water. The effect is instantaneous and cataclysmic. The invisible force holding back the two walls of water is released. With a roar that shakes the heavens and the earth, 1 billion tons of water collapses inward. The sea returns to its full strength in a single, violent, world-ending moment. The walls of water do not flow back, they crash down, swallowing the entire Egyptian army in a churning, violent vortex of foam and fury. The screams of thousands of men and horses are snuffed out in an instant. The pride of Egypt, the most powerful army in the world, is utterly and completely annihilated. Then silence. The sun is now fully risen, casting a golden light on the eastern shore of the Red Sea. The water is calm again, as if nothing had happened. The Israelites stand on the beach, their clothes damp with spray, their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and dawning, unbelievable joy. The sea, which was their barrier, became their path, and the path that was their salvation became a tomb for their enemies. As the tide begins to turn, the evidence of their deliverance washes ashore. The bodies of Egyptian soldiers, the wreckage of their golden chariots, the drowned forms of their mighty war horses. They see their oppressors, the men they had feared their entire lives, lying dead on the sand. They are not just free, they are safe. The threat is gone. It has been erased from existence. A great shout of praise rises from the people, a spontaneous, unified roar of thanksgiving. They look at Moses not with accusation, but with reverence. And they look to the heavens with a new and profound understanding of the God who had redeemed them. Then Miriam, the sister of Moses and Aaron, a prophetess in her own right, takes a tambourine in her hand. All the women follow her with tambourines and dancing. And Miriam sings out, her voice clear and strong, a song of victory that will be sung for generations. Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. Eleazar finds his family. He pulls Tamar and Sarah and Caleb into his arms, and they weep together, not with fear, but with a release so profound it feels as if their very souls are being cleansed. Caleb looks out at the water, his young eyes wide. He had seen the terror of the approaching army. He had walked on the floor of the sea, and he had witnessed the power that had saved them. He will tell this story to his children, and they to their children. It is the story of their birth as a nation, a story not of their own strength or cunning, but of the jaw-dropping, undeniable power of a God who could make a highway through the heart of the sea. It was the moment a nation of slaves stood on the far side of impossibility, truly free for the first time, breathing the air of a world made new. Centuries pass. The echoes of Miriam's tambourine have long faded from the shores of the Red Sea. The children of the slaves who walked through the parted waters are now a nation established in a land of their own, a land promised to their forefathers, flowing with milk and honey. They have had judges and kings, victories and defeats, periods of profound faith, and seasons of disastrous forgetfulness. The stories of God's power, once the bedrock of their identity, have, for many, become just that, stories, faded legends from a time when God seemed to walk more closely with man. And in the vacuum of a fading faith, other gods, other powers, have begun to creep in. Our second story unfolds in this era of spiritual twilight in the northern kingdom of Israel, now a separate entity from its southern cousin, Judah. The throne is occupied by a king named Ahab, a man who the scriptures say did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of the kings who had come before him. Ahab was not necessarily a monster of calculated cruelty. He was worse. He was a man of weak character, a spiritual vacuum, a king more interested in political alliances and opulent palaces than in the covenant his nation had with its God. And into that vacuum had swept a force of nature, a woman of iron will and zealous conviction, his wife, Queen Jezebel. Jezebel was not an Israelite. She was a Phoenician princess, the daughter of the king of Sidon, and she had brought her gods with her. She was a devout, fanatical worshiper of Baal, the great storm god of the Canaanites, the rider of the clouds who was believed to grant fertility to the land and rain from the heavens. Along with him came Asherah, his consort, whose worship involved sacred poles and rituals often steeped in sensuality. To Jezebel, the god of Israel, Yahweh, was a local desert deity, a primitive tribal god whose demands for exclusive, covenantal faithfulness were an obstacle to progress and cultural sophistication. With the full backing of her compliant husband, King Ahab, Jezebel launched a cultural and religious revolution. She built a grand temple to Baal in the capital city of Samaria. She put hundreds of prophets of Baal and Asherah on the royal payroll, making their pagan worship the official state religion. But she didn't stop at promotion. She moved to eradication. A great persecution began. The prophets of the Lord were hunted down like animals. They were slaughtered, their altars torn down, their faith driven underground. A righteous man named Obadiah, who was the administrator of Ahab's own palace, lived a life of terrifying secrecy, having hidden 100 of God's prophets in 2 caves, smuggling them bread and water to keep them alive. Fear was a palpable smog that hung over the faithful remnant in Israel. To speak the name of Yahweh with conviction was to sign your own death warrant. The nation was spiritually bleeding out, and into this darkness, a man appeared. He was a man who seemed to have no origin, appearing in the biblical record as abruptly as a lightning strike. His name was Elijah, the Tishbite. He was not a man of the court. He was a figure of the wilderness, dressed in a garment of hair with a leather belt around his waist. He was gaunt, fiery, and utterly uncompromising, a man who seemed to be carved from the very rock and earth of the land he so fiercely loved. He walked into the court of King Ahab, stood before the most powerful man in the nation, and delivered a message that was both a prophecy and a divine declaration of war. "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve," Elijah declared, his voice raw and powerful, "there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word." It was the ultimate challenge. Baal was the god of rain. The entire basis of his worship was his supposed power over the fertility of the land. Elijah, speaking for the forgotten God of Israel, had just declared that the sky would shut itself dry. It was a direct, cosmic challenge. Whose God truly controlled the heavens? And then, as quickly as he appeared, Elijah vanished. For 3.5 years, he was a ghost, a rumor. He hid in the wilderness, fed by ravens. He lived in the home of a foreign widow in Zarephath, where God performed miracles to keep her and her son alive. And all the while, his prophecy choked the life out of Israel. The first year, the people may have scoffed. Droughts were common. But as the months stretched on, the scoffing died in their parched throats. The sky became a sheet of brass, merciless and unchanging. The brooks and streams dried up, leaving behind cracked, reptilian patterns in the mud. The fields, once green and fertile, turned brown, then a dusty, lifeless gray. The earth became as hard as iron, refusing to yield anything but dust. Livestock, gaunt and skeletal, dropped dead in the fields, their lowing cries for water fatting to a rasping silence. Famine, a gaunt and hollow-eyed specter, began to stalk the land. The people's ribs started to show. Children's bellies bloated from malnutrition. The worship of Baal, the rainbringer, continued, perhaps with even more frantic energy. But the heavens remained silent, sealed, and mocking. The land itself was becoming a testament to Baal's impotence. King Ahab himself, along with his faithful servant Obadiah, had to personally scour the land, desperately searching for any remaining patch of grass near a spring, just to keep the royal horses and mules alive. It was in the 3rd year of this crippling drought that the word of the Lord came again to Elijah. "Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land." The time for hiding was over. The time for the final confrontation had arrived. Elijah's journey back into the heart of Israel was a journey through a dying land. He walked past withered vineyards and olive groves, past the carcasses of animals, past the desperate, hollowed-out faces of his countrymen. The air was thick with dust and despair. He eventually encountered Obadiah, the secret believer, who was on his own desperate search for pasture. Obadiah fell on his face when he saw the prophet, the most wanted man in the kingdom. "Is it really you, my lord Elijah?" he whispered, his voice a mixture of awe and terror. "It is," Elijah replied, his gaze steady. "Go and tell your master, Elijah is here." Obadiah was horrified. "What have I done wrong, that you are handing your servant over to Ahab to be killed? As surely as the Lord your God lives, there is not a nation or kingdom where my master has not sent someone to look for you." And whenever a nation or kingdom claimed you were not there, he made them swear an oath that they could not find you. And now you say, "Go, tell your master, Elijah is here." I don't know where the Spirit of the Lord may carry you when I leave you. If I go and tell Ahab and he doesn't find you, he will kill me. To be the bearer of this news was a death sentence if Elijah were to disappear again. But Elijah reassured him, swearing a solemn oath that he would present himself to Ahab that very day. A reluctant Obadiah went and delivered the message. And soon, the king himself, the man who had presided over the nation's decay, rode out to meet the man he blamed for it all. When Ahab saw Elijah, his face was a mask of fury. Years of frustration, of political pressure, of watching his kingdom wither, were focused on this single, defiant figure. "Is that you?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You troubler of Israel." Elijah did not flinch. He stood his ground, an immovable rock of divine conviction against the tide of royal rage. He pointed a finger back at the king, and his reply was like a thunderclap in the still, dry air. "I have not made trouble for Israel," he declared, "but you and your father's house have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals." The accusation hung there, undeniable, proven by the barren land all around them. The trouble wasn't the drought was a symptom. The trouble was the idolatry, the faithlessness, the spiritual cancer that had infected the heart of the nation, starting with its king. And then Elijah laid down the gauntlet. He issued a challenge so audacious, so public, that Ahab, for all his power, could not refuse it. Perhaps the king was desperate enough to try anything for rain. Perhaps he was so confident in the sheer numbers of his favored prophets that he saw it as an opportunity to publicly humiliate and execute his nemesis. Whatever his reason, he listened. "Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel," Elijah commanded, his voice taking on the authority of a king himself. "And bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." The stage was set. Mount Carmel, a majestic mountain range that juts out into the Mediterranean Sea, a place that in fertile times was lush and green, a symbol of God's blessing. Now, it too was brown and withered. It would be the theater for the greatest spiritual showdown in Israel's history. Words spread like a brushfire. From every corner of the dying kingdom, the people began to make their way to the mountain. They were a curious, desperate, and spiritually confused crowd. They were the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, yet they had been taught to bow to the gods of their neighbors. They were starving for food, but even more, they were starving for truth. They climbed the slopes of Carmel, their faces etched with uncertainty, to witness the confrontation between the lone, wild prophet of Yahweh and the 850 state-sponsored, well-fed prophets of the pagan gods. The scene on the mountain top was one of stark contrasts. On one side stood the prophets of Baal and Asherah, a great company of men in their priestly robes, confident in their numbers and their royal patronage. They were the religious establishment, the voice of the sophisticated, modern faith. On the other side stood Elijah, alone, a single man in a hairy cloak against an army of priests. Between them, a vast, silent, waiting crowd of ordinary Israelites. Elijah strode forward and addressed the people, his voice ringing out over the silent assembly. His question cut to the very heart of their national identity crisis. "How long will you waver between two opinions?" he cried. "If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." His words were met with a profound, telling silence. No one in the crowd answered a word. They were a people spiritually paralyzed, trying to have it both ways, worshiping Yahweh in times of tradition and Baal in times of convenience. They were hedging their bets, and their silence was their confession. Elijah continued, laying out the terms of the contest. It would be a test of fire. "Get 2 bulls for us," he said to the prophets of Baal. "Let them choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God." The proposal was brilliant in its simplicity and fairness. Fire from heaven was a well-known sign of divine power and acceptance. There could be no trickery, no sleight of hand. The crowd murmured its assent. "What you say is good," they replied, their interest piqued. The spiritual drama had them hooked. "You go first," Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, a magnanimous gesture that also served a strategic purpose. Since there are so many of you, the prophets of Baal, confident and eager, chose their bull. They prepared it with practiced ritual, laying it carefully on the wood of their newly built altar. And then, as the morning sun began its ascent into the cloudless sky, they began to pray. At first, their calls were measured, a rhythmic chanting of their God's name. "Baal, answer us. Baal, answer us." The sound echoed across the mountaintop. But the only answer was the silence of the sky and the shuffling feet of the watching crowd. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the assembly. Nothing happened. They became more animated. They began to dance around the altar, a strange, limping ritual. Their chants grew louder, more frantic. "Baal, answer us." Still nothing. The bull lay untouched on the wood. The sky remained a perfect, mocking blue. Noon arrived, the time of day when the sun is at its highest and hottest. This should have been Baal's moment of greatest power. His failure was now becoming conspicuous, embarrassing. It was then that Elijah, who had been watching silently, decided to add a little fuel to the fire, but not the kind they were hoping for. He began to mock them, his words dripping with a holy sarcasm that was designed to expose the utter absurdity of their faith. "Shout louder," he called out to them, a wry grin on his face. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or he has stepped away for a moment, or he is on a journey. Or perhaps he is sleeping and must be awakened. His taunts struck a nerve. The prophets of Baal, humiliated and increasingly desperate, descended into a wild frenzy. If their chants weren't working, they would offer their own pain, their own blood, to get their god's attention. They grabbed swords and spears and began to slash themselves, gashing their bodies until blood flowed freely. Their ritual devolved into a gruesome, horrifying spectacle. They raved and prophesied, working themselves into an ecstatic, bloody trance. Their cries of Baal, answer us, now mixed with grunts of pain and the wild, unhinged shrieks of fanatics. They continued this grotesque performance all through the afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent towards the Mediterranean. But there was no response, no voice, no one answered, no one paid attention. The bull remained on the altar, the wood remained unlit. Their God was silent, their God was absent, their God was nothing. As the time for the evening sacrifice approached, the prophets of Baal collapsed in exhausted, blood-soaked heaps. Their failure was absolute, public, and undeniable. The great company of priests had been defeated by the silence of their own God. Then Elijah stepped forward. The contrast in his demeanor was stunning. There was no frenzy, no shouting, no blood. There was only a quiet, deliberate calm. "Come here to me," he said to the people. The crowd, which had kept its distance from the bloody spectacle, now drew near, their eyes fixed on the lone prophet. Elijah's first act was not to build a new altar, but to repair an old one. He found the altar of the Lord that had been torn down, a victim of Jezebel's persecution. This was an act of restoration. He was not introducing something new. He was calling the people back to something ancient and true. He took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, a powerful, symbolic reminder of their unified identity as the people of God's covenant. With these stones, he carefully rebuilt the altar in the name of the Lord. Then he did something that must have made the parched, drought-stricken crowd gasp in disbelief. He dug a trench around the altar, a trench large enough to hold about 2 seahs, or 15 liters, of seed. And then he gave an order that bordered on insanity. Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood. His servant and a few others looked at him, stunned. Water was more precious than gold. They were in the 3rd year of a catastrophic drought. Every drop was priceless, and he wanted to pour it on a sacrifice. But there was a compelling authority in his voice. They obeyed. They found a source of water, perhaps a nearby spring that had not yet run dry, or water they had painstakingly carried up the mountain, and they filled 4 large jars. They brought them to Elijah, and he had them pour the precious liquid all over the bull, the wood, and the stones, soaking everything. He wasn't finished. "Do it again," he said. They did. The water ran off the altar and began to fill the trench. "Do it a 3rd time," he commanded. They poured a final 4 jars of water over the offering. By now, everything was utterly drenched. The wood was waterlogged. The meat of the bull was dripping. The 12 stones of the altar were dark with moisture, and the trench around it was completely filled with water. Elijah had created a scene of calculated impossibility. He had deliberately made it as difficult as possible for a fire to start by any natural means. He was leaving no room for doubt, no place for skepticism to hide. If this altar lit, it would be an act of God, and God alone. With the stage now perfectly set, Elijah stepped up to the dripping altar. He did not shout. He did not dance. He did not cut himself. He simply prayed. He lifted his face to the silent heavens, and his voice was clear and steady. A simple, direct conversation with the God he knew was listening. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," he began, "let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." His prayer was short, profound, and selfless. It was not for his own vindication. It was for God's glory and for the restoration of his people. He asked for a sign not to prove that he was right, but so that the people would know that Yahweh was God and that he loved them enough to call them back to himself. And then it happened. It was not a spark. It was not a lightning strike from a distant cloud. From the clear, empty sky, the fire of the Lord fell. It was a column of supernatural flame, an instantaneous, terrifying, glorious descent of divine power. It fell with a sound like a rushing wind and a light that outshone the setting sun, and it consumed everything. It consumed the water-soaked bowl. It consumed the waterlogged wood. It consumed the 12 heavy stones of the altar, vaporizing them into dust. It consumed the very soil and dust beneath the altar. And then, with a great hiss, it licked up every last drop of water that was in the trench, leaving it bone dry. In a single, breathtaking moment, everything was gone, erased by a fire so hot, so powerful, so utterly complete that it defied all earthly explanation. Entire assembly of Israel, who had watched this impossible event, screamed as one, and then fell to the ground, prostrate. They buried their faces in the dust, trembling with a primal fear and a sudden, electrifying certainty. The wavering was over. The paralysis was broken. Their spiritual amnesia was burned away in the heat of that holy fire. And from the thousands of people lying on the ground, a single, unified chant rose up, a confession of faith that was forged in the fire of God's own presence. "The Lord, He is God," they cried out, their voices thick with awe. "The Lord, He is God." The question of who held power in the heavens had been answered. Baal, the god of fertility and storm, had remained silent and impotent before a bloody altar. Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, had answered with a torrent of fire onto an altar drenched in water. The contest was over. In the aftermath of this stunning victory, Elijah, now filled with a righteous zeal, turned to the crowd. "Seize the prophets of Baal," he commanded. Don't let a single one get away. The people, their faith now galvanized into action, needed no second bidding. They rounded up the 450 prophets whose God had failed them. Elijah led them down the mountain to the Kishon Valley, a place where the winter rains would normally create a rushing brook. There, in an act of grim, necessary judgment, he had them executed. It was a harsh and violent act, but in the context of the time, it was seen as a divine purging, a surgical removal of the spiritual cancer that had been planted by Jezebel and was systematically killing the soul of the nation. With the false prophets eliminated, there was one last piece of business. The land was still dying of thirst. Elijah said to King Ahab, who had watched the entire spectacle in stunned silence, "Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." And then, while Ahab went to break his fast, Elijah climbed back to the top of Mount Carmel. He crouched down on the ground, put his face between his knees, and began to pray for the rain he had been promised. He sent his servant to go and look toward the sea. The servant went, looked out over the vast, empty expanse of the Mediterranean, and returned. "There is nothing," he reported. "Go back," Elijah said. 6 more times he sent his servant. 6 more times the servant returned with the same report. "There is nothing." The sky remained clear, but Elijah's faith, having just been vindicated by fire, did not waver. On the 7th time, the servant returned, and his words would become immortal. "A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea." That was it. That was the sign. A tiny, insignificant wisp of a cloud. But to Elijah, it was the herald of a deluge. "Go and tell Ahab, hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you," he commanded. In a matter of minutes, the sky that had been clear and brassy for 3.5 years grew black with clouds. The wind began to whip and roar. And then the heavens opened up and a torrential downpour began, a drenching, life-giving, drought-shattering rain. Ahab raced his chariot back to his city of Jezreel, and Elijah, filled with the power of the Lord, tucked his cloak into his belt and outran the king's chariot the entire way. On Mount Carmel that day, the people of Israel were given a lesson in divine clarity. They learned that their God was not a God of convenience, not one option among many. He was the God of fire and the God of rain, the God who could consume stone and soil with his holiness, and the God who could bring life back to a dead land with his mercy. It was a jaw-dropping, undeniable display of power that called a nation back from the brink, proving once and for all who truly ruled the heavens and the earth. We leave the rain-soaked slopes of Mount Carmel and travel forward in time, our journey taking us across deserts and centuries. We move from a nation struggling with its identity in its own land to a time of profound dislocation, a time of exile. The northern kingdom of Israel, where Elijah once ran, has long since been conquered and scattered by the Assyrian Empire. Now, its southern counterpart, the kingdom of Judah, has also fallen. The holy city of Jerusalem, the site of Solomon's great temple, has been sacked and burned by the new superpower of the age, the mighty Babylonian Empire. The promises of God seem to hang by a thread. The people of the covenant have been uprooted, and the best, brightest, and most skilled among them have been forcibly marched across the Fertile Crescent to the heart of their conqueror's domain, the magnificent, terrifying city of Babylon. Our story is set here, in this sprawling metropolis of towering ziggurats and walls so wide that chariots could race upon them. It is a city of immense wealth, military might, and staggering intellectual achievement. And at its center sits a man who is, for all intents and purposes, the most powerful human being on the face of the earth, King Nebuchadnezzar. He is not merely a king, he is an emperor, a living legend. His armies are invincible, his ambition boundless. He is the architect of the famous Hanging Gardens, a wonder of the ancient world, and the builder of the brilliant blue-glazed Ishtar Gate. He is a man of genius, of vision, and of immense pride. He is also a man of volatile temper, prone to fits of incandescent rage, a ruler whose slightest displeasure could mean instant and gruesome death for anyone who crossed him. He is a man who genuinely believes he is the master of his own destiny, the center of the known universe, living and working within the very heart of this overwhelming pagan empire is a small community of Jewish exiles. Among them are 4 young men of noble Judean birth who had been selected for their intelligence and aptitude to serve in the king's own court. They had been given new Babylonian names to encourage their assimilation, to wash away their Hebrew identity. Hananiah, whose name meant Yahweh is gracious, was now called Shadrach. Mishael, meaning who is what God is, was renamed Meshach. And Azariah, Yahweh has helped, was now known as Abednego. Along with their brilliant friend Daniel, whose Babylonian name was Belteshazzar, they had navigated the treacherous currents of the Babylonian court with a quiet and radical faithfulness. They had excelled in their studies, mastering the complex literature and language of the Chaldeans, and had risen through the ranks to become trusted and respected administrators of the province of Babylon. They were, in essence, model immigrants, successful, integrated, and respected. But they had drawn a line in the sand. They served the king diligently, but they would worship only their God, the God of Israel. The defining crisis of their lives arrives not on a battlefield, but on a vast, flat plain called Dura, somewhere near the city of Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar, in an act of supreme egotism and imperial propaganda, has commissioned the construction of a monument to his own glory. It is a colossal statue, wrought of or covered in gold, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. Imagine it, a 9-story golden figure towering over the flat landscape, blazing in the fierce Mesopotamian sun, a blinding testament to the wealth, power, and perceived divinity of the Babylonian Empire and its king. But the statue itself is not enough. It must be consecrated, acknowledged, venerated. And so, Nebuchadnezzar issues a decree that reverberates through every corner of his vast, multicultural empire. He summons every official of any consequence, the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial leaders. They are to gather on the plain of Dura for the statue's dedication ceremony. The decree is simple and absolute. A royal herald, his voice amplified to reach the massive assembly, proclaims the king's command. At the moment, they hear the sound of the royal orchestra, a grand, eclectic ensemble of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and pipes. Every single person is to immediately fall on their face and worship the golden statue. It is a loyalty test on a mass scale, a command for absolute submission, not just of body, but of spirit. And the penalty for disobedience is equally simple and horrifically specific. Whoever does not fall down and worship, the herald's voice booms, will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. There, in that great sea of officials, stand Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. As high-ranking administrators for the province of Babylon, their attendance is not optional. They stand there in their official Babylonian attire, their robes, trousers, and turbans, listening to the command that presents them with an impossible choice. They have lived their lives in Babylon as loyal and productive subjects. They respect the king and the authority he represents. But this command strikes at the very root of their identity. It is a direct, non-negotiable violation of the first and most foundational commands of their God, etched in stone and seared into the heart of their covenant. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For everyone else gathered on that plain, the command is a political formality, a simple act of deference to a powerful king. For these three men, it is a choice between life and eternity, between loyalty to an earthly emperor and faithfulness to the King of the universe. Then the moment arrives. A hush falls over the crowd. The conductor raises his hands, and the first notes of the grand orchestra sound out, a wave of music that rolls across the plain of Dura. It is the signal. All around them, like a single, massive field of wheat bending in the wind, the assembled dignitaries of the Babylonian Empire fall to the ground. The rustle of thousands of fine robes is followed by a profound silence, as every satrap, governor, and judge presses their face into the dust before the gleaming golden idol. But in the midst of this universal prostration, three figures remain standing. Imagine the sheer, terrifying isolation of that moment. To be the only one standing in a crowd of thousands who are bowing. To know that every eye that is not pressed to the ground will see you. It is an act of quiet, courageous, and profoundly conspicuous defiance. They do not make a scene. They do not shout in protest. They simply stand. And their vertical posture in a horizontal world is a declaration louder than any orchestra. Their act of faithfulness does not go unnoticed. There are certain Chaldeans, astrologers, and court officials who have long been jealous of the rapid rise of these Jewish exiles in the king's administration. They see this not as an act of religious piety, but as an act of treason, and more importantly, as a perfect opportunity to eliminate their rivals. They waste no time. They hurry to the king, their faces a mask of feigned loyalty and righteous indignation. They approach Nebuchadnezzar, bowing low. "May the king live forever," they begin, their words dripping with sycophantic praise. "Your Majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace." They are careful to first remind the king of his own absolute authority and the severity of his own decree. Then they spring their trap. "But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your Majesty." This is the venomous stroke. They frame the disobedience not as a matter of their conscience, but as a matter of personal disrespect to the king. It is not that they won't worship the statue. It is that they pay no attention to you. They twist religious conviction into personal insult, knowing full well the king's famously fragile ego. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. The poison works instantly. The scripture says Nebuchadnezzar flew into a furious rage. This was more than just the anger of a king being disobeyed. It was the fury of a man who considered himself divine being publicly slighted. His face, which a moment before was basking in the glory of his own monument, likely turned dark with wrath. His voice, a moment before serene, now booms across the plain. "Summon Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." The three men are brought before the fuming emperor. The orchestra is silent. The crowd of officials is now standing, watching this terrifying drama unfold. The king's eyes burn with rage as he looks at the three administrators who had, until this moment, served him so well. Even in his fury, he cannot quite believe it. He gives them one last chance to save themselves. The question he asks is laced with a mixture of threat and genuine disbelief. "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up?" He doesn't wait for an answer. He lays out the choice for them one more time, as if speaking to disobedient children. "Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good." He offers them an easy out, a simple act of compliance, and all will be forgiven. Their lives will be spared. Their careers will continue. But if you do not worship it, his voice drops, becoming cold and hard. You will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. And then, in his towering arrogance, he throws down a challenge to the God he cannot see, the God whose authority he cannot comprehend. He sneers, "Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" In that moment, the contest is no longer between three men and a king. It is between the God of Israel and the pride of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar has made himself the opponent of the Almighty. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stand before the most powerful man in the world, a man who holds their lives in his hands, and they are not afraid. Their response is one of the most remarkable statements of faith ever recorded. They do not grovel. They do not argue. They do not even seem to feel the need to justify themselves. Their voices are calm, respectful, but utterly unshakable. "O Nebuchadnezzar," they begin, addressing him with the proper respect, but without a trace of fear. "We do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." Their quiet confidence is stunning. It suggests they are operating under a different authority, appealing to a higher court whose verdict is all that matters. Then they deliver their declaration of faith, a statement in two parts, each more profound than the last. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. This is the first part, a confident assertion of God's power. They know their God is sovereign. They know he has the ability to rescue them. Parting the Red Sea, making fire fall from the sky, saving 3 men from a furnace is well within his capabilities. They believe in a God of miracles, but it is the second part of their statement that elevates their faith to an entirely different level. But even if he does not, they continue, their voices unwavering. "We want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. This is the heart of it all. This is faith that has been refined in the fire before the fire is even lit. Their obedience to God is not transactional. It is not conditional on their own survival. They are not serving God so that he will rescue them. They are serving God because he is God. Their worship is not a currency they are using to purchase a miracle. Their worship is the point. Whether they live or die is secondary. Their primary purpose is to remain faithful. They have already decided. The outcome is in God's hands, but the choice is in theirs, and they have made it. They will not bow. Nebuchadnezzar is not accustomed to being denied anything, let alone being defied with such calm, immovable conviction. Their peaceful resistance enrages him more than any violent rebellion ever could. The scripture says his face was distorted with fury. The mask of royal composure shattered, revealing the wild, uncontrollable tyrant beneath. He was so enraged that he began shouting orders. "Heat the furnace 7 times hotter than usual," he bellowed. 7 times hotter was a colloquial expression for as intensely hot as it can possibly be. The furnace on the plain of Dura was likely a large industrial kiln used for making bricks or smelting metal, already capable of generating incredible temperatures. To heat it 7 times hotter meant a frantic, desperate effort by the stokers. They would have been feeding the flames with massive amounts of fuel, pitch, naphtha, and wood, until the furnace roared like a captured storm, its fiery breath visible for miles, the very air around it shimmering and warping with a heat that was itself a weapon. Then Nebuchadnezzar called for some of the strongest soldiers in his formidable army. He ordered them to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The 3 men offered no resistance as their hands and feet were tied tightly with ropes. They were still fully dressed in their courtly attire, their fine robes and turbans that signified their high rank, a rank they had just forfeited for their faith. The bound men were then dragged towards the mouth of the roaring furnace. The heat was now so overwhelming, so explosively intense, that the very air was a wall of fire. As the powerful soldiers, the best of Nebuchadnezzar's army, strained to haul the three men to the opening and cast them in, the flames leaped out from the furnace with a hungry, violent roar. The heat was so extreme that it instantly incinerated the soldiers. The king's strongest men, the instruments of his wrath, were killed by the very fire they were meant to use on others. This terrifying detail serves a crucial purpose in the narrative. It establishes, beyond any doubt, that the furnace was not survivable. No human being could withstand that level of heat for even a fraction of a second, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, bound and helpless, fell into the heart of the blazing inferno. From the perspective of every onlooker, the story was over. Three foolishly stubborn men had met a gruesome, instantaneous end. A puff of smoke, a brief sizzle, and then nothing. Nebuchadnezzar, his rage momentarily sated, likely stood watching, waiting for the screams that never came. But what he saw next defied all reason. It shattered his understanding of the world. The scriptures say the king leaped to his feet in amazement. He stared, wide-eyed and open-mouthed, into the viewing port of the furnace, his face pale with shock. He turned to his advisors, his voice no longer a roar of fury, but a stammer of utter disbelief. "Weren't there three men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" he asked, his voice trembling. His counselors, equally baffled, replied, "Certainly, Your Majesty." "Look," Nebuchadnezzar exclaimed, his finger pointing shakily at the inferno. "I see four men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the fourth looks like a son of the gods." The king, from his vantage point, was witnessing the impossible. Inside the very furnace that had just killed his strongest soldiers, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not burning. They were not screaming. They were not even lying on the ground. They were walking. They were moving about freely, as if on a pleasant evening stroll. The ropes that had bound them were gone, the only things the fire had been able to consume. And they were not alone. With them in the midst of the flames was a fourth figure. Nebuchadnezzar, a polytheistic pagan, struggles to describe what he is seeing. He grasps for the highest language he knows, a son of the gods. He is seeing something divine, a being of light and glory, a protector who has entered the place of execution and transformed it into a sanctuary. This fourth man, this angelic or divine being, was walking with them, shielding them, his presence turning the deadliest fire on earth into a place of perfect safety. The king's arrogance melted away in the face of this terrifying, beautiful miracle. His rage was replaced by a profound and fearful awe. He, the great Nebuchadnezzar had commanded men to be thrown into a fire, and their God had gone in with them. He scrambled as close to the furnace's opening as he dared, the heat pushing him back. His voice, when he called out, was stripped of all its earlier tyranny. It was the voice of a man who had just seen a power infinitely greater than his own. "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego," he cried out, and the title he gave them was a confession of his own defeat and their God's victory. "Servants of the Most High God, come out. Come here." He had thrown them in as criminals. He was inviting them out as holy men. He had challenged their God. Now he was acknowledging him as the Most High God, a title of supreme authority. And from the heart of the fire, they walked out. The three men emerged from the furnace and stood before the king and the entire astonished assembly. A space cleared around them as the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors all crowded in, their faces a mixture of fear and wonder. They stared, they pointed, they whispered. They examined the three men who should have been nothing more than a handful of ashes. The miracle was in the details. Not a single hair on their heads was singed. Their fine Babylonian robes were not scorched or discolored. They had walked through an inferno, and there was not even the smell of smoke or fire upon them. The fire had touched them with a divine selectivity. It had been powerful enough to consume the ropes that bound them, but it had been rendered completely powerless against their bodies and their clothes. The only thing the fire had destroyed was their bondage. It had set them free. Nebuchadnezzar, his mind reeling, could only respond with worship. He had commanded worship for a dead, golden idol. Now, he offered spontaneous praise to the living God who had performed this wonder. "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego," he declared, his voice resonating across the silent plain. "He has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God." His confession was complete. He understood their motivation. He acknowledged their faith, and he recognized the power that had honored that faith. Then, true to his tyrannical nature, his new conviction immediately took the form of a terrifying decree. "Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into a pile of rubble. For no other God can save in this way." It was a brutal, violent edict, but it was also the highest praise a man like Nebuchadnezzar knew how to give. He had witnessed a power that could nullify his own, a God who could rescue from his hand. His worldview had been irrevocably shattered and remade, and the story concludes with a final, beautiful irony. The very act of defiance that should have ended their lives and careers led to their greatest advancement. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Their faithfulness in the face of death earned them greater favor and authority in the very empire that had tried to consume them. This story is a profound shift in our journey. The miracles at the Red Sea and on Mount Carmel were grand national spectacles, God revealing his power to his chosen people on a massive scale. Here, the miracle is more intimate, yet no less powerful. It takes place in a foreign land under a pagan king. It is a testament to a God who is not confined to a holy land or a holy temple. He is present with his faithful people wherever they are, even in the heart of the furnace. It's a story about a different kind of power, not the power to part a sea or call down fire from a clear sky, but the quiet, unshakable power of a faith that refuses to bow, and the presence of a God who will walk through the fire with those who trust in him. Our journey now takes its most significant leap, not just across lands or empires, but across covenants. We travel through the silent centuries that separate the last Hebrew prophets from the dawn of a new era. We leave the world of kings and exiles in Mesopotamia and arrive in a small, dusty corner of the immense Roman Empire, the province of Judea. The world is ruled by Caesar. The land is governed by his proxies like Pontius Pilate and puppet kings like Herod. It is a time of occupation, of heavy taxes, and of a simmering, desperate hope among the Jewish people for a promised deliverer, the Messiah, who would free them from their oppressors and restore the glory of their nation. And into this world, a man has come from a forgotten town called Nazareth in the northern region of Galilee. His name is Jesus. He is not a king in a palace or a priest in the temple. He is a carpenter, a teacher, a storyteller of unparalleled genius. For the past year or so, a whirlwind of supernatural activity has surrounded him. He walks through towns and villages, and the blind see, the lame walk, lepers are made clean, and the deaf hear. He speaks with an authority that astonishes the learned scribes and Pharisees. He doesn't just interpret the law, he speaks as if he is its source. Huge crowds, like swarms of bees drawn to honey, follow him everywhere he goes, pressing in on him, desperate for a healing touch, a word of wisdom, a morsel of the bread he seems to offer for the soul. Our story begins on the evening of one particularly long and grueling day of this ministry. Jesus has been teaching by the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. A beautiful freshwater lake that is the heart of the region. The crowd has been so immense, so crushingly large, that to be heard, he had to get into a small fishing boat and push out a little from the shore, using the water to amplify his voice as he taught them in parables. All day long, he has poured himself out, telling stories of sowers and seeds, of mustard grains and hidden treasures, explaining the mysteries of the kingdom of God to a people hungry for hope. Imagine the sheer exhaustion of it, the constant press of bodies, the unending litany of needs, physical, emotional, and spiritual, the weight of their expectations, the intensity of their desperation. Jesus, in his full humanity, was spent. His voice was likely hoarse, his body weary from the sun and the constant output of energy. As evening descended, casting long shadows from the hills of Galilee across the water, he turned to to his inner circle of followers, the 12 men he had chosen to be his disciples. "Let us go over to the other side," he said. It was a simple request, but it was a clear attempt to find a moment of peace, to escape the suffocating demands of the crowd, and find some quiet respite on the less populated eastern shore. His disciples, several of whom were seasoned fishermen, readily agreed. They untied their boat, and a few other small boats that had been nearby set out with them, forming a small flotilla on the placid evening water. Let's take a moment to picture the men in that boat with Jesus. There is Peter, burly, impulsive, quick to speak, and quick to act. There is his brother Andrew. There are the two sons of Zebedee, James and John, nicknamed the Sons of Thunder for their fiery personalities. There is Matthew, the tax collector, a man who knew numbers and ledgers far better than he knew sails and rigging. These were, for the most part, rugged, practical men. Peter, Andrew, James, and John, in particular, were masters of this very lake. The Sea of Galilee was not some alien environment to them. It was their office, their factory floor, their backyard. They knew its currents, its depths, its moods. They had spent countless nights upon its surface, casting their nets, reading the winds, navigating by the stars. They were at home here. As they pushed out from the shore, the scene was one of perfect tranquility. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The water was like glass, reflecting the fading light. The gentle lapping of the waves against the wooden hull and the soft creak of the mast were the only sounds. The clamor of the crowd faded into a distant memory. A cool evening breeze began to blow, filling their single sail. Jesus, utterly drained, made his way to the stern of the boat, the back part, where the steering oar was. There, someone had left a cushion. He lay his head down, and almost immediately, the deep, profound sleep of the truly exhausted overtook him. His humanity is on full display here. The one through whom the universe was created, the Word made flesh, was now asleep, rocked gently by the waves of the lake he had made. But the Sea of Galilee is a notoriously treacherous body of water. It sits low in the great Jordan Rift Valley, over 600 feet below sea level, and is surrounded by steep hills and ravines. This unique geography creates a kind of natural wind tunnel. Cold air from the surrounding highlands, particularly the Golan Heights to the east, can suddenly pour down these ravines and collide violently with the warm, moist air rising from the lake's surface. With little to no warning, the calmest of evenings can explode into a storm of terrifying ferocity. And that is precisely what happened. As they reached the middle of the lake, a furious squall, what the Greek text calls a seismos megas, a great shaking, the same word used for an earthquake, descended upon them. It was not a storm that built gradually. It was a sudden, violent assault. The wind shrieked down from the hills like a predator, tearing at their sail. The sky, just moments before a peaceful twilight, turned a menacing, inky black. The glassy surface of the lake was instantly whipped into a churning cauldron of frothing, angry water. The waves, which had been gently lapping at the boat, began became monstrous, rising up in great, dark walls. They crashed over the bow, sending torrents of cold water sluicing across the deck, drenching the disciples and filling the boat. The small fishing vessel, which had felt so sturdy in the calm, was now tossed about like a child's toy, plunging into the troughs between waves with a sickening drop, then cresting precariously on the next peak. The groaning of its timbers, a constant, terrifying chorus against the howling of the wind. For a time, the fishermen among them would have relied on their skill. This was their element. They would have sprung into action, their movements practiced and sure. Lower the sail, man the oars, grab the buckets and bail. These were the familiar rhythms of their trade, the ingrained responses to danger they had faced many times before. They would have shouted instructions to each other over the roar of the wind, their faces grim with concentration, their muscles straining as they fought to keep the boat from being swamped. But this storm was different. It was unnaturally violent, possessed of a demonic fury that seemed to mock their efforts. The waves were relentless, breaking over the sides of the boat faster than they could bail the water out. The vessel grew heavy, sluggish, sinking lower and lower into the churning sea. The moment of realization must have been horrifying. It would have dawned first on Peter or James, the most experienced among them. His face, illuminated by a flash of lightning, would have turned from grim determination to ashen-faced terror. They were not going to make it. All their skill, all their strength, all their lifelong experience on this lake was not enough. The sea was going to claim them. The boat was sinking, and in the stern, through all of this chaos, Jesus slept. He slept through the howling wind. He slept through the crashing waves and the splintering sound of the mast straining against the ropes. He slept through the frantic shouts of his disciples and the cold spray that must have been lashing his face. He was in a sleep so deep, so profound, that the very chaos of creation, unhinged, could not stir him. It is in this moment of utter desperation that the disciples' fear finally overcomes their reluctance to disturb their exhausted teacher. They stumble and crawl across the pitching, waterlogged deck to the stern where he lies. The scene is one of pure chaos and panic. They shake him, their hands trembling, their voices cracking with terror as they scream to be heard above the tempest. The Gospels record their slightly different, but equally desperate, cries. In Matthew's account, it is a direct plea for salvation. Lord, save us. We're going to drown. It is a cry of pure, unadulterated fear. Luke records a similar cry. Master, Master, we're going to drown. The repetition of Master underscores their panic, but it is Mark's version that perhaps best captures the complex, rawly human emotion of that moment. They scream at him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? There, in that question, is the heart of their crisis. It is not just fear of the storm. It is a flicker of doubt, of indignation, of spiritual panic. He is the miracle worker. He is the one they have left everything to follow. And here they are, about to die, and he is asleep. How can he sleep? Is he indifferent to their plight? Does he not care about their terror? It is the cry of every human heart in the midst of a storm. God, where are you? Don't you even care? At their frantic cries, Jesus awakens. There is no startle, no confusion, no fear. He opens his eyes and takes in the scene with a serene calm that is in itself otherworldly. He sees the shrieking wind. He sees the mountainous waves. He sees the boat filled with water on the verge of sinking. And he sees the faces of his dearest friends contorted with terror. And the first thing he does is address not the storm outside, but the storm of fear raging within their hearts. He looks at them, and his voice is steady and clear, though perhaps tinged with a hint of loving disappointment. "You of little faith," he says, "why are you so afraid?" He asks the question before he acts. The order is important. He wants them to understand that the source of their terror is not the wind or the waves. The source of their terror is their failure to truly comprehend who was in the boat with them. They had seen him heal a leper with a touch and a paralytic with a word, but their faith was still confined to what he could do on dry land. They had not yet made the leap to understand that the one who had mastery over disease also had mastery over creation itself. Having gently rebuked their fear, he then turns his attention to the storm. He rises to his feet in the small, violently rocking boat, a feat that should have been impossible. Standing there, a calm, commanding figure in the midst of the maelstrom, he does not lift his hands to the sky and pray for his Father to intervene. He does not plead with the elements. He confronts them. He speaks to the wind and the waves as a master speaks to a disobedient dog. He rebuked the wind, and then he said to the churning, chaotic sea, "Quiet, be still." The original Greek is even more abrupt and powerful. Siopa, Pephamoso. It's a sharp, commanding muzzle. It's the same word he used to command a demon to be silent. He was treating the chaotic forces of nature as a usurping power that had to be put back in its place. And the effect was instantaneous, absolute, and profoundly unnatural. The wind did not gradually die down. It did not taper off. It ceased. One moment, a howling, deafening gale the next, a complete and total silence. The sea did not slowly subside. The massive, churning waves did not roll to a gentle stop. They fell flat. The water became utterly, preternaturally calm. The Greek describes it as a great calm, the perfect inverse of the great shaking that had begun the storm. One moment, a violent, chaotic sea threatening to tear their boat to pieces the next, a surface as smooth and still as a mirror, reflecting the now emerging stars. Imagine the sudden, ringing silence. The only sound would have been the dripping of water from the sail and the hull, and the frantic, ragged breathing of the disciples. The transition from pandemonium to peace was so abrupt, so total, that it was in itself terrifying. They had been saved from the storm, but they were now confronted with something far more frightening. Their fear of drowning was gone, but it was replaced by a new and much deeper kind of fear. It was the fear the Old Testament calls the fear of the Lord. It was awe. It was the terror that comes from standing in the presence of raw, cosmic power. The storm had been a fearsome thing, a violent and deadly force of nature. But it was a natural thing. They understood storms, but a man who could stop a storm with a word, a man whose quiet command could bring the very elements to a heel like a disciplined child. That was not natural. That was something else entirely. They were safe, but they were more terrified than they had ever been. They looked at each other, their faces pale in the sudden starlight, their eyes wide with a new, dawning comprehension. And then they looked at Jesus, who now stood peacefully in their midst. And they began to whisper to one another, their voices hushed with a terror that was also a form of worship. "What kind of man is this?" they asked. "Even the winds and the waves obey him." That question is the entire point of the story. They had left their homes and their livelihoods to follow a man they thought was a great prophet, a healer, perhaps even the long-awaited Messiah, who would be a great political and military leader. They had seen his power over sickness and his authority over demonic spirits. But on this night, in the middle of the sea, their understanding of him was irrevocably shattered and rebuilt on a far grander scale. This was not just a man with a special connection to God. This was a man who wielded the very power of God. This was a man who could command the forces of creation. The ancient psalmist had written, "You rule over the surging sea. When its waves mount up, you still them." They had always understood that to be a description of God Almighty. And now, they had seen a man in their own boat do that very thing with a quiet word. The one who was asleep in the stern was the Lord of the storm. The one whose humanity made him so tired he needed a cushion to sleep was the one whose divinity could command the sea to be still. They had set out that evening to cross a lake, seeking a bit of rest. They arrived on the other side as changed men, haunted and awestruck by the question that would define the rest of their lives. They thought their greatest danger was the storm. They were wrong. Their greatest danger and their only hope was the man who had been asleep in the back of the boat. This wasn't just a story about a miracle. It was a revelation of identity. It was the moment the disciples began to understand that they were not just following a rabbi. They were following the creator of the heavens and the earth, who had chosen for a time to sail in a small boat with them. We have traveled a long road together on this journey. We stood on the shores of a sea that parted, a nation of slaves walking to freedom on dry ground. We felt the searing heat of a fire that fell from a clear sky on Mount Carmel, consuming stone and water to prove that the Lord, He is God. We walked, unbound and unharmed, through a Babylonian furnace, so hot it killed the king's own soldiers, protected by the presence of a fourth, glorious man in the flames. And just a little while ago, we were in a small fishing boat, tossed by a demonic storm, when a man woke from his sleep and commanded the wind and the waves to be still. Each of these moments has revealed a different facet of a power that is beyond our human comprehension. Power over armies and empires, power over the elements of creation, power over political tyranny, and the forces of nature. But our final story brings us face to face with the last and greatest enemy. It is the one adversary that no human being, from the mightiest pharaoh to the humblest fisherman, has ever defeated. Our final story is about the confrontation with death itself. To get there, we must move our narrative forward towards the final, tense, and fateful days of Jesus' earthly ministry. The time of widespread popularity in the villages of Galilee is largely over. The tide of public opinion is turning, poisoned by the relentless opposition of the scribes, the Pharisees, and the temple authorities in the great center of Jewish life, Jerusalem. The atmosphere is no longer one of hopeful excitement, but of dangerous, gathering shadows. Jesus is now a marked man. To speak in his favor is to risk censure. To be seen in his company is to invite suspicion. The path he walks is leading inexorably towards a violent, preordained collision with the powers that be. The shadow of a Roman cross looms ever larger over his every word and deed. It is in this fraught and dangerous climate that we find a small pocket of peace, a sanctuary for Jesus, just a couple of miles outside the hostile city of Jerusalem. It is the village of Bethany, nestled on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. And in this village lives a family that Jesus loves with a special and profound affection. They are two sisters and a brother, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. This is not just another stop on Jesus' itinerant preaching circuit. This is a home. This is where he can come, weary from the crowds and the controversies, and simply be with friends. We can imagine the scene: Jesus reclining at their table, sharing a simple meal, the tensions of his public life melting away in the warmth of their friendship. We know a little about their personalities from the brief glimpses the scriptures give us. Martha seems to be the practical one, the doer, always busy with the details of hospitality, perhaps a little anxious that everything be just right. Mary is the contemplative one, the listener, who once sat at Jesus' feet, hanging on his every word, oblivious to the household chores. And Lazarus is the brother they both adore, the man of the house, whose presence makes their family complete. John's Gospel makes a point of stating, with simple clarity, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. This deep, personal love is the engine of our story. The story begins not with a miracle, but with a crisis. Jesus is away, ministering across the Jordan River in the region where John the Baptist first preached. He and his disciples are at a safe distance from the dangers of Jerusalem. And a messenger arrives, having traveled with great urgency, carrying a short, heartbreaking plea from Bethany. The message is not a formal request, but an appeal from one friend to another, freighted with an implicit trust. Lord, the message says, the one you love is sick. They don't even need to use his name. Jesus knows who the one you love is. Jesus hears the message, and his response is, to everyone around him, utterly baffling. He looks at the anxious messenger and at his own concerned disciples and says, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory so that God's Son may be glorified through it. It is a strange, cryptic, forward-looking statement that no one could possibly have understood. It sounds like a reassurance, a promise that Lazarus will recover. And then he does the most inexplicable thing of all. The scripture tells us, in a verse that is as shocking as it is profound. So, when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Let that sink in. The word "so" is almost jarring. Because he loved them, he waited. Because this was for God's glory, he delayed. From the disciples' perspective, this must have been bewildering. Their friend, Jesus' dear friend, is desperately ill, and Jesus, the great healer, the one who could cure people with a touch or a word, decides to wait. From the perspective of Mary and Martha back in Bethany, these 2 days must have been an eternity of agony. Imagine the scene in their home. The initial wave of hope after the messenger was dispatched. Jesus knows he's coming. As soon as he gets here, everything will be all right. They would have been watching the road, listening for his footsteps. But the hours crawl by. A full day passes. Lazarus's condition worsens. The fever climbs. His breathing becomes shallow. The hope that had sustained them begins to curdle into a sick, creeping dread. Where is he? Why hasn't he come? Another day passes. The vigil by Lazarus's bedside becomes more desperate. And then, the moment they had feared arrives. Their beloved brother breathes his last. The light in their home and in their hearts goes out. Jesus did not come. He could have saved him, but he didn't. The hope is not just deferred, it is dead. The mourners arrive. The house fills with the sounds of weeping and the formal, ritual wailing of a family in grief. The body of Lazarus is prepared for burial, wrapped in linen strips with aromatic spices, and placed in the family tomb, a small cave carved into the hillside, and a heavy stone is rolled across the entrance. Their friend was sick. They called for help, and help did not arrive in time. Meanwhile, across the Jordan, after 2 full days have passed, Jesus suddenly turns to his disciples and makes a simple announcement. Let us go back to Judea. His disciples are aghast. They look at him as if he's lost his mind. Their fear is immediate and entirely rational. But Rabbi, they protest, their voices urgent. A short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back. They remember the last trip to Jerusalem all too well. The hostility, the angry mobs, the accusations of blasphemy. They had barely escaped with their lives. To them, Judea is a death trap, and Jesus is proposing they walk right back into it. Jesus responds with a short, enigmatic teaching about walking in the daylight versus stumbling in the night, a metaphor about acting in God's timing. The disciples, still focused on the physical danger, don't seem to grasp his meaning. It is Thomas, the man history would nickname Doubting Thomas, but who here shows a kind of gritty, courageous loyalty, who speaks for the group. He sees the madness of the plan, but his commitment to Jesus overrides his fear. He turns to the other disciples and says, with a heavy sense of fatalism, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." They are convinced this journey will end in their deaths, but if Jesus is going, they will go too. It is a moment of flawed, fearful, but beautiful devotion. Then Jesus decides to be more direct about their purpose. Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, he tells them, using a common, gentle euphemism for death. But I am going there to wake him up. His disciples, in a moment of almost comical, heartbreaking literalism, completely misunderstand him. Lord, they reply, relieved, if he sleeps, he will get better. They think he means Lazarus has passed the crisis and is now in a natural, healing sleep. They see no reason to risk their lives on a journey if Lazarus is already on the mend. Jesus has to spell it out for them, his voice now filled with a solemn gravity. Lazarus is dead. The words fall like stones into the silence. And for your sake, he continues, looking at their confused and frightened faces, I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Now the pieces start to click into place, but the picture they form is terrifying and audacious. The delay was intentional. The death was part of the plan. Jesus is not going to Bethany to comfort two grieving sisters. He is going to confront the tragedy head-on. He is going to use this moment of ultimate loss to teach his disciples a lesson in faith that will dwarf everything they have seen before. The journey to Bethany is a somber one. When they arrive in the vicinity of the village, they learn that Lazarus has already been in the tomb for 4 days. In the Jewish understanding of that time, the soul was believed to hover near the body for 3 days, hopping to return. The 4th day marked the point of no return. It was the moment corruption began, the moment that death was seen as absolute, final, and irreversible. The 4-day detail is crucial. It removes any possibility that Lazarus was merely in a coma or a swoon. He was truly, medically, and spiritually dead. The house is in the midst of Shiva, the 7-day period of intense mourning. It is filled with friends and relatives, including a number of Jews who have come from Jerusalem to comfort the sisters. The air is thick with sorrow. Martha, ever the practical one, the woman of action, hears that Jesus is approaching the village. She doesn't wait for him to come to the house. She leaves the crowd of mourners and goes out to meet him on the road. Her first words to him are a torrent of pent-up grief, faith, and heartbroken accusation, all mingled together. Lord, she says, her voice thick with unshed tears, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. It is the cry of a wounded heart. The unspoken question hangs in the air between them. Why? Why didn't you come? But even in her pain, her faith in him remains, fractured but not broken. She quickly adds, but I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. She doesn't know what to ask for. The resurrection of a man dead 4 days is beyond the scope of her imagination. But she still believes in Jesus' unique connection to God. She still believes he holds a power she cannot comprehend. Jesus looks at this strong, grieving woman, and he speaks to her the words that will become the cornerstone of the Christian hope. Your brother will rise again, he says. Martha nods, her understanding of his words confined to the conventional theology of her day. "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day," she replies. For her, the resurrection is a distant, future theological event. It is a comfort for the end of time, not a hope for this Tuesday afternoon. Jesus then gently but radically corrects her. He pulls that distant hope into the immediate present moment. He makes a declaration that is perhaps the most profound of all his "I am" statements. He doesn't say, "I will bring about the resurrection." He says, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die." He is claiming to be the very source, the very embodiment of resurrection power. He is telling her that eternal life is not just a future promise. It is a present reality in him. And then he puts the question directly to her, making it intensely personal. "Do you believe this?" Martha, standing on a dusty road, her heart shattered by grief, is faced with the most important question of her life. And in that moment, her faith crystallizes. "Yes, Lord," she confesses, her voice finding a new strength. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." It is a confession of faith that rivals Peter's, made not in a moment of triumph, but in a moment of utter loss. Martha then hurries back to the house and speaks to her sister Mary in secret. "The teacher is here," she whispers, "and is asking for you." Mary, who had remained in the house, surrounded by the mourners, immediately gets up and goes out to him. The mourners, assuming she is going to the tomb to weep, follow her. Mary reaches the place where Jesus is, and her reaction is different from Martha's. She doesn't engage in a theological dialogue. She simply falls at his feet, her body racked with sobs. And through her weeping, she echoes her sister's exact words, the refrain of their shared grief. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus sees her weeping and sees the crowd of mourners who had followed her also wailing and crying, a profound and visceral reaction takes hold of him. The scripture says he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. The Greek word used here is an intense one. It implies a kind of angry indignation, a shudder of fury. He is not just sad, he is angry. He is angry at the pain, at the grief, at the brutal ugliness of death, and the havoc it wreaks on the people he loves. He asks, his voice thick with emotion, "Where have you laid him?" "Come and see, Lord," they reply. And as he walks with them toward the tomb, something extraordinary happens. Jesus, the Son of God, the one who had just declared himself to be the resurrection and the life, begins to cry. The shortest verse in the entire Bible says it all. Jesus wept. His tears are a profound mystery and a profound comfort. He is not weeping because Lazarus is dead. He knows he is about to call him back to life. He is weeping out of pure, unadulterated empathy. He is weeping because his friends are hurting. He is entering into their grief, feeling the full weight of their loss. He is weeping because this is not the way the world was supposed to be. Death is an intruder, an enemy, and its presence grieves the heart of God. In those tears, we see not a distant, untouchable deity, but a God who is willing to step into the mess, pain of our human experience and weep with us. The Jews who see his tears are moved. "See how he loved him," they murmur. But others, more skeptical, whisper, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" The question hangs in the air, a testament to their limited understanding of the far greater work he is about to perform. Jesus, still deeply moved, arrives at the tomb. It is a cave, as was common, with a large, heavy stone rolled against the entrance, sealing it shut. He looks at the stone, the final barrier between the world of the living and the world of the dead, and he gives a simple, shocking command: "Take away the stone." A horrified hush falls over the crowd. It is Martha, the practical one, who breaks the silence. She is appalled, her mind immediately going to the grim reality of the situation. "But Lord," she protests, her voice a frantic whisper, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." She is trying to save him from the stench, the gruesome physical evidence of decay. She is trying to protect her brother's final dignity. She is crashing back down from the heights of her earlier confession of faith to the hard, smelly reality of a decomposing body. Jesus turns to her, his gaze gentle but firm. "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" It is a final, loving challenge to set aside her earthly senses and trust in his heavenly power. Hesitantly, a few men step forward and put their shoulders to the great stone. With a scraping, groaning sound, they roll it away, revealing the dark, cold blackness of the tomb within. Jesus now lifts his eyes to heaven. He prays aloud, not because he needs to persuade the Father, but for the sake of the crowd that is watching, so they will understand the source of his power. "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you have sent me." Then he takes a breath. He turns his face to the dark opening of the tomb, and he does something no one has ever done before. He calls out in a loud, commanding voice, a voice that is not a plea, but a summons, a voice that echoes against the hillsides and plunges into the depths of the grave itself. "Lazarus, come out." It is a command directed at a man 4 days dead. It is a word of life spoken into the heart of death. The universe holds its breath. The crowd stands frozen, their eyes wide, staring at the black rectangle of the open tomb. For a moment, there is only silence, and then a sound, a faint, shuffling sound from within the darkness. And then a figure emerges into the daylight, stepping out of the tomb. It is a man, wrapped from head to foot in the white linen strips of his burial clothes. His face is still covered by a separate cloth. He is stiff, awkward in his movements, but he is moving. He is walking. He is alive. The crowd gasps. Some may have screamed. Others would have fallen to their knees. They are staring at a man who, moments before, was a decaying corpse. And now he is standing before them, a living, breathing paradox, still dressed for his own funeral. Jesus looks at the stunned, speechless crowd, and then at the still-bound figure of his resurrected friend. He gives one last, beautifully simple command, an instruction to the community to participate in the final stage of the miracle. "Take off the grave clothes," he says, "and let him go." The people, moving as if in a dream, approach Lazarus and begin to unwrap the bindings of death. As the final cloth is removed from his face, he takes his first breath of renewed life, his eyes blinking in the afternoon sun. He is not a ghost. He is not a reanimated corpse. He is Lazarus, their brother, their friend, restored to them whole and alive. Death has been commanded to give back its prize. This miracle was the most undeniable, the most public, and the most dangerous of Jesus' life. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Many of the people who had come to mourn with Mary and Martha, who had witnessed this impossible event with their own eyes, put their faith in Jesus. How could they not? They had seen the glory of God. But others, their fear of Jesus' power and its political implications overriding their awe, went straight to the Pharisees and told them what had happened. For the religious council, the Sanhedrin, this was the final straw. This was a miracle too big to ignore, too powerful to tolerate. It would cause a revolution. The high priest, Caiaphas, gathered the council and made his infamous, unwittingly prophetic statement. It was better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish. The raising of Lazarus was the act that sealed Jesus' own death warrant. In calling his friend out of the tomb, Jesus was knowingly and willingly walking into his own. He gave life to Lazarus, knowing it would cost him his own life. And so, our journey through these jaw-dropping moments of God's power ends here, at an open tomb in Bethany. We have seen God's power to save his people from an army, to prove his identity with fire, to protect his servants in the flames, and to command the chaos of nature into peace. But here, we see the culmination of that power. It is power over our final and most feared enemy. It is the power to stare into the abyss of death, decay, and utter finality, and speak a word that brings forth impossible, glorious life. It was the ultimate preview, the great dress rehearsal for the even greater miracle to come, when Jesus himself would walk out of his own tomb, defeating death forever. It is the ultimate promise that for those who believe in him, even a tomb is not an ending, but merely a doorway to the resurrection and the life.